in Texas wineries, theory and practice. And so inevitably, some of you are going to have questions. Please add them to the chat, and at the end of the presentation, we'll tackle them one by one. So I'm going to turn it over to Seth.
All right, thanks, Justin. Good morning, everybody. As I'm sure most of you know, we're right in the middle of harvest right now. So things are a little bit crazy in the winery. I had to wipe grape juice off my face before I got on screen this morning. And I wanted to, at Justin's invitation, talk to you for a little bit about SO2 or sulfur dioxide as a tool in the winery. We'll talk a little bit about the theory. I'll try not to bore you to death with a lot of stick figure chemistry drawings, but then we'll talk about the practice of utilizing it functionally in a Texas winery. It is different here in Texas, and we'll get into that. Because we're in the middle of harvest, this may be a little bit shorter, but I'll try to take all the questions that we have once we're done. So SO2, or sulfur dioxide, what is it? So it's something that we can add to wine and use it as an antioxidant, an antimicrobial, and so essentially it's a preservative. Now there's a lot of maybe, like I said, bad and the ugly information out there about what SO2 is. So I hope today we can kind of clear that up, because on the back of every bottle it says contains sulfites, which really worry people. But sulfur has been used as a...
Hey, Seth, can I interrupt you real quick?
Yes, ma'am.
Your audio is not ideal. If you're either in a well or we're only getting every fifth word. Is there headphones you can use or something?
How about turning off your camera and see if that helps? That sometimes will help.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I'm being in rural Texas, your connection speeds are not always top notch.
Right.
Is that better?
That helps a lot.
Good. Okay, so backing up here, SO2 or sulfur dioxide is an antioxidant, an antimicrobial that we can use in the winery to help us make clean and untainted wines. However, there's a little bit of misinformation about SO2 out there, so I wanted to kind of clear some of that up. On the back of every bottle, it says contains sulfites, and people get worried that that's going to have a negative health impact. Sulfur's been used in food products for preservation purposes since back to Roman times, and it's present in a lot of fermented food products as well as prepared foods. Fermentation itself by yeast produces enough SO2 that in most cases it meets the legal threshold for the requirement to add the disclaimer on the back of contains sulfites on the bottle. So even if a winemaker doesn't even get any sulfites at all, they may still have to make that legal disclaimer because it's produced during fermentation as well. There's a lot of misinformation. I won't dive too deep into it about, I get headaches from the sulfites, and usually that's associated with red wines. White wines typically have higher SO2 levels. There's about 10 times as much SO2 in a serving of dried fruit there is in a bottle of wine, but most people don't complain about dried fruit headaches. And as Andrea talked about, are things that can cause headaches like biogenic. There's poor microbial control and maybe spontaneous or native malolactic fermentation, and those can definitely produce things that will cause headache. So there is an argument out there that SO2 might actually help prevent some of the negative stereotypes that are vast discussion for a different day. So what is it? So the first is gas, which is 100% SO2 gas. You usually only see this in very, very large wineries. And the reason is SO2 gas is extremely dangerous. It can very quickly kill you. And so there's a lot of safety protocols and storage precautions that have to be taken. So this does happen. I worked in a large winery that had SO2 gas, but it is uncommon and there's a lot of safety precautions. So that would not be the route I would recommend, especially if you're a small winery. Most common form of SO2 to the powder. It's usually potassium metabisulfite or MBS. There's a couple of other forms of this powder, but potassium metabisulfite is far and away the most common. A few things that you need to know about potassium metabisulfite: it's 57% by weight SO2, and it does oxidize over time. So in our winery, I have a lock and seal basket in a container to preserve the powder from oxidation over time. And I really consider potassium metabisulfite only to strength. So half of the powder weight is actually usually used for practical calculations, and we'll talk about that here in a second. The other method that you see SO2 added is a solution. So this is like some of that powder, and you mix it up in liquid, or you buy it pre-mixed. And it's really useful when you have to do a lot of sulfur additions. So say like barrels, so you've got 100 barrels that you need to add sulfur to. Mixing up a solution and then dosing out a certain amount of that solution is a lot easier than weighing out a little bit of powder each barrel.
Hey, Seth, I hate to interrupt you again, but the audio is coming through the computer and internet is really poor. And so we are just not getting the full opportunity to hear your presentation. Do you have a way to dial in? I'm wondering if you left this on, put it on mute, and dial in.
I can do that.
Do you need the dial-in information?
See if I can find it.
Okay.
I mean, if you could send it to me.
I'm getting ready to send you right now.
Okay. Sorry
Oh,
for the audio problems.
I don't have your cell phone. Justin, do you have his cell phone?
Let me check. I think I probably do.
Yeah, I can. I'll send you the dial-in information. I'm sorry, guys. It's just real important that we be able to hear this excellent presentation.
I do not.
Okay. On its way.
Sabrina, do you see that information in the chat from Kent? He's suggesting to adjust the Zoom settings. I wonder if that would help.
Okay. We'll have to have him try that.
I know when I'm doing a live broadcast with music, sometimes the filters cause it to cut in and out, phase in and out, and this might work, it might not, but it's worth a try.
It's worth a try. Exactly. Thank you, Kent.
Sure.
Meredith, do you have any SO2 jokes?
Not off the top of my head. Let me think on that.
Justin, I just sent you the dial-in to send to Seth because I don't have his cell phone. I'm sorry. Thank you all very much for your patience. We're going to get this fixed so that we can make sure that you guys can hear everything.
I blame the San Saba internet.
I did not hear you, Seth.
I said I blame the San Saba internet.
There you go.
And I can hold the mic right up on my mouth. Does that help?
No. If you're still using the computer audio, that is not, that it's the instability of the internet. So that's why I'm suggesting dialing in. So you keep your video up, mute your video, mute your computer, but use your phone as your audio. Okay, we're not hearing him. He's advancing the slide. Let me find out. Okay, I think we've got him. Seth, is that you? I just admitted a phone number. There he is. Seth
Okay,
is,
how are you?
okay, you're going to need to make sure your computer is muted.
Try again.
Do a
Can
test
you hear
for
me
me.
now?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that better for everyone? I'm assuming yes.
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 Thank
All
you.
right. So sorry about the confusion there. So I'm just, again, going to back up just a hair. We were talking about applications and methods of SO2 in the winery. So there's SO2 gas. Talked about it just a second ago, but it's very dangerous. I only see this at very large wineries, and I don't recommend. The most common method of adding SO2 in the winery is potassium metabisulfite, which is a powder, usually abbreviated KMBS. There are other types of powder, but potassium metabisulfite is usually the most common. It's 57% by weight SO2, which we'll get into how to calculate some of this stuff here in a minute. And it does oxidize over time, so a very tight storage container that doesn't transmit oxygen is important. But I still, even though I use a sealed container, usually estimate that it's only about 50% by weight KMBS, or 50% by weight actual SO2 as that powder ages. The other way to add SO2 in a winery is using a stock solution. You can buy these pre-mixed or make them yourself. And it's super useful, say if you have 100 barrels that you have to add SO2 into, instead of weighing out a little bit of powder for each barrel, you can make up a solution and, meter out a certain number of mils per barrel, and that makes that a lot easier. A 6.6% solution is a very common one that I've seen in wineries. Some really smart person came up with why that concentration is ideal. That wasn't me. But one thing you have to remember is that powder weight, if you're making the solution yourself, I went into a winery that was adding a 6% solution of SO2, and they thought they were adding a certain quantity. So a 6.6% solution would be 66 grams per liter, but only half of that powder is actually SO2. So you really need 132 grams per liter to get that concentration, and they were adding half as much SO2 as they thought they were. So things to be careful about if you're making up solutions, and remember that you will most likely use KMBS in the winery as your SO2 method, and that only about half of it by weight is actually SO2. Okay, so like I said before, I was going to try to not bore you with a whole bunch of chemistry, but I think there are a few pieces of SO2 chemistry that it's important to understand. So SO2 can be present once it's added to wine in several different species. So you have essentially 3 species, and I'll get into what they are here in a second. But what percentage of that species is present is dependent on the pH of the wine. And just a reminder, pH is an inverse logarithmic scale that measures the concentration of hydrogen ions, so essentially the acidity. And wine pH typically worldwide is 3.0 to 3.7, and yet Texas wine is a wholly different animal. We usually see on the low end, it's 3.5 all the way up to 4.3. I had the distinct pleasure of getting my first harvested wine in at 4.7 the other day. That was really fun. When you start getting into high pH, you get to some real challenges, and SO2 is actually plays a key role in that, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So the species that you can get, and you can see this little chart on the right here, what percent form you get according to pH. The dark blue line is your molecular SO2, and that is your antimicrobial component. And you can see that as you go from pH 3 to pH 4, the percentage of that present drops off precipitously. The pink line is going to be your bisulfite, and that's what's free in the wine to interact with different components, aldehydes, quinones, pigments, and several other constituents. Now that bisulfite can be in 2 different forms. It can be what's free to interact and what's bound up by the components that I just previously mentioned. So you'll have both free and bound bisulfite, and then the last component, the sulfite ion, is negligible at wine pH and isn't going to significantly impact your winemaking. So we talk about wine pH, right? And you talked about this a little bit with Andrea in the presentation before. So pH is a problem when it comes to SO2, and can you just adjust it? Well, of course you can, kind of. So there's pH and titratable acidity, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these concepts, but pH is a measure of the free hydrogen ions, and titratable acidity is more akin to the acid that you can taste. So your tongue is not a pH probe. It behaves more like, again, TA is going to be more like the acid that you can taste, and that's why we measure that. So you can acidulate the wine. You can add acid to lower the pH using tartaric acid, which is the preferred method of addition because it lowers the pH versus the least increase in titratable acidity. So 1 gram per liter of tartaric acid will lower the pH 0.1 log and raise the titratable acidity by 1 gram per liter, dependent on buffering capacity of the wine, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that's generally the calculation that's used. And so you can lower it to a point, but you reach a ceiling when your titratable acidity starts to get too high because the wine would then taste too acidic. So what does that mean? What does SO2 do for us? So there's free SO2 that we talked about versus total. And so total SO2 is the combination of free and bound SO2, and there is a legal limit at 350 parts per million in the USA. Total SO2 can contribute to negative sensory impact on the wine, like the smell of burnt match when you get to high concentrations. And that ranges from 60 to 80 parts per million. And as we'll talk about here in a second, that's a super low threshold for us. So your free SO2 remains free if it's not bound up by quinones, aldehydes, and pigments to interact with components of the wine and byproducts of oxidation. So free SO2 is your antioxidant. And it can also contribute to molecular SO2, which is your antimicrobial. So molecular SO2 is a function of how much free you have. And if we look at this chart here, you'll see that it very conveniently ends at 3.8. And that's generally where the book on how to deal with wine stops. And as we all know, it's pretty routine to have Texas wine pH quite a bit higher than that. And you're not able to adjust it down based on the acid problem in the last slide. So in order to achieve molecular SO2, you would have to have a very high amount of free SO2, which you can see is on the axis on the left there. And that's not even, your total SO2 is going to be higher than your free because that's a combination of free and bound. I know this is getting a little confusing, but the point being that free SO2 to achieve molecular antimicrobial function is not practical at Texas wine pH. That's the key takeaway. Because you can see there, you'd have to have free SO2 in excess of 60 parts per million, which means your total SO2 is going to be well above that sensory threshold to have negative impacts on the wine. So welcome to the Texas wine industry. This is our central problem, that we don't have an antimicrobial benefit from using SO2 in the winery in general. It really doesn't contribute to an antimicrobial function. So we're doomed, right? So this is the kind of the key takeaways now that we get away from the chemistry stuff, right? So molecular SO2 is an antimicrobial, and you have none most of the time. When you add SO2, some will be free, some will get bound up. I did mention pigments. It will bleach the color out of your red wine just a little bit. I consider it, a worthy trade-off to have the antioxidant protection, but you are going to lose a little bit of color when you add sulfur dioxide to your red wine. So the free stuff, the free SO2 is what's useful as an antioxidant, and that's it. You really don't get a whole lot of antimicrobial action from it at our wine pH. So we need to regularly monitor free and total SO2, and it's really simple, and we'll talk more about that here in a second, but aeration oxidation, or AO, is a really simple, you don't have to be a lab genius, it's really simple and cost-effective monitoring apparatus, and I highly recommend this method, and we'll get into a little bit on that here in a second. So what does this mean in practice? So when do we add SO2? So you can add it in the juice phase. You can limit polyphenol oxidase, or PPO, which is present early on in juice. It's what makes your juice brown or your avocados brown. Same enzyme, and you can use SO2 to inhibit polyphenol oxidase activity. And I say you can use it to annoy undesirable microbes because you don't really get a true antimicrobial effect from it. So you can use it at juice stage. You can use it after alcoholic fermentation if you're not going to perform malolactic fermentation. As you just talked about MLF before, ML bacteria is susceptible to SO2. So I wait until after malolactic fermentation is complete before adding SO2 if I intend to do malolactic fermentation on that wine. You can also use SO2 during extended aging as an antioxidant. So I try to maintain a constant target of anywhere between 20 and 35 parts per million free SO2 during extended aging. So if I put a wine into barrel for a long time, I'll check it every 4 to 6 weeks to make sure that I have that antioxidant protection. And you can also use it after an oxygen exposure event. So let's think about that for a second. So oxygen exposure is a problem. So we're using SO2 as an antioxidant, but what if we didn't expose the wine to as much oxygen? That would help mitigate a whole lot of SO2 use, and especially considering that we have an upper limit that we can apply to the wine over its lifetime, and also, at our high wine pH, having less oxygen exposure is also going to help with that antimicrobial effect that we don't get from SO2 at our Texas wine pH. So below is a list of a survey of how much dissolved oxygen is picked up, that's in milligrams per liter, for various activities in the cellar. So you can see that pretty much anything you do, including just leaving a wine in a tank, particularly if it's a variable capacity tank, those do transmit a little bit of oxygen over time, or a fixed capacity tank that has headspace, you will pick up dissolved oxygen over time. And then anytime you move the wine or stir it or anything else, you're exposing it to oxygen. So dissolved oxygen, or DO, is something that plays into this whole makeup of how and when to use SO2. So dissolved oxygen can be monitored in the cellar using a DO meter. A good DO meter is not cheap. They're $2,000 to $3,000, but can really change how the qualitative preservation of your wine. So the other way you can do it, if you don't want to spend $2,000 to $3,000 on a dissolved oxygen meter. It's kind of like the forensic way of finding how much oxygen you're picking up because it's after the fact. But you'll see a depletion in total SO2 for every milligram of oxygen that you pick up as dissolved oxygen over time. So you can monitor your total SO2 to see how much oxygen you're picking up. And you can also manage it in the cellar. So you can limit headspace, which is a good idea. You can also use a lot of inert gas, and this is what I do in our cellar to mitigate dissolved oxygen pickup and mitigate the depletion of my SO2, is I use inert gas. But the inert gas you use matters. So common gases you'll see in wineries are CO2 or argon, and those are great because they're heavier than air, and they're good for blanketing headspace if you do have headspace in a tank. And they'll sink to the top of the liquid, but they're also soluble gases, so that's why you can carbonate a wine with CO2. Nitrogen is an insoluble gas, and it won't carbonate your wine, but it will purge out dissolved oxygen. And so I use high purity nitrogen in a sparging stone, which is that picture on the top there that's in line. So if I'm moving the wine, I just plug in my gas into that sparging stone, and it bubbles through the wine as I transfer it. And I can monitor the DO after a transfer to see how much I picked up and if I need to sparge it a little bit more. And I recommend this as a good practice if you want to mitigate oxygen contact with your wine. Also, wine temperature matters. So gas is inversely soluble to temperature in liquid, so that's why you get your champagne really, really cold when you want to open it, so that it doesn't explode. It's because you want that liquid or that gas to be dissolved in the liquid. So gas is inversely soluble to temperature, but what that means is that the colder the wine is, the more gas you're going to pick up, the more dissolved oxygen you're going to pick up. So if you're going to move a wine, it's actually better that it's not as cold. I promised I wouldn't try to bore you with stick figure chemistry drawings. This is actually SO2 in wine reacting with various components in the wine, and I want you to take a couple of key things away from this without glazing over too much. Number one is that SO2 isn't just like magically interacting with wine. There are actually a lot of different moving parts here, one of which is that hexagonal figure on top with the two OHs, and that's a polyphenol or a tannin, right? And we know that we have tannin in wines. And then iron and copper are also involved in the reaction. So, tannin plays a role in oxidation as well. This is why you can leave, if anyone's ever had a bottle of vodka that you've left open for weeks on end, it will not go bad. If you leave a bottle of whiskey open for weeks on end, I'm sure none of you do that, right? It actually does go bad after a period of time, and that's because that whiskey is brown because it's extracted tannins from the wood, and they will oxidize over time. And so why does this matter? So tannins work both ways for us as winemakers. So if you have a lot of tannin, they can act as a protective agent. You can have some get oxidized up, and it really won't matter. So tannic red wine really does hold up well to oxidation. But if you don't have a whole lot, they actually act as a participant in your oxidation reaction that SO2 is trying to reverse. So white wines with elevated tannin content can actually oxidize quite a bit faster as a result. And I think this is particularly important here in Texas winemaking. It's something that I feel very strongly about because I see a lot of white wines, particularly ones that come off the Texas High Plains that have been machine harvested, that have quite elevated levels of tannin in white wine. Not so much that you're going to taste it as tannic, but I mean, you can even just look at the wines and they're often more yellow, and that's because they've had that tannin pickup as they sat in their picking bins with the skins and the juice in contact with each other, and that's just what happens as you pick up more tannin that way. So I, as a winemaker, pretty aggressively tannin fine, not only to clean up the color and make sure that you can't taste tannin in the white wine, but I also do it so that I remove some of that component that's participating in an oxidation reaction. So it's up to the winemaker's call. Like I said, if you have a lot of tannin, they're actually your friends. But if you have maybe just a little bit more than you want, you can actually be hurting yourself. So tannins work both ways. So final use and strategy. SO2 is a tool in your toolkit, but man, I don't recommend, I say don't mess with Texas wines. pH is a problem. I encourage you to look at wine as a medium for growth for microbes. And, SO2 at our higher pH means it's more friendly to microbial growth because there's less acid. And I just don't think that we have the luxury here in Texas to say, hey, you know what, I don't need, I'm going to let this wine ferment itself, and I'm not going to use SO2. That's really popular in the natural wine movement at the moment, and I've had some really great wines made that way, and we made a lot of good wine that way in New York, but our pH was like 2.9 to 3.2. Here we're like 3.7 to 4.2. And that's a huge difference in acidity, and the door is much more open to problems here in Texas. So I don't recommend it, but you can make those choices on your own. So as a result, SO2 is a tool in the toolkit, but I would encourage you to explore other methods of limiting oxidation and microbial mitigation. So oxidation, you can choose to remove tannins, so you can find them out using PVPP, casein, albumin, isinglass, or macroox. There's some misconceptions about macroox. And you are oxidizing your wine intentionally. So if you choose to go that route, talk to somebody who's done it before and then knows what's going on. You can use inert gas to keep dissolved oxygen low. You can manage the temperature of your wine. So low temperature means more oxygen pickup. You can also find out some of the other catalysts that are involved in oxidation reactions. Remember, we talked about copper and iron are involved, in that oxidation reaction. So you can actually remove copper and iron, but that's probably the most complicated method on this list. And then finally, you can monitor your dissolved oxygen and SO2 levels regularly, and you can keep them at an adequate level. For microbes, conveniently, low dissolved oxygen wine is less friendly to many microbes. So you get the 2-for-1 there. Non-Saccharomyces yeast at picking time can limit the growth of spoilage microbes. So I use Mentionicovia in the picking bins. I actually inoculated. It's a non-fermenting yeast that produces compounds that inhibit other microbes from growing. So again, at our wine pH, adding SO2 to the juice is mostly just going to annoy other microbes. It's not going to actually inhibit their growth. So I use non-Saccharomyces yeast in our fruit stages. And then you can use other tools in the toolkit like lysozyme and chitosan to kill microbial populations pretty effectively, but those are very expensive, and lysozyme can also inhibit some other malolactic activity that you may want later. So you have to use those carefully. And then, the other thing you can do is keep your wine cold, and that will slow down microbial growth. But as we talked about, it'll also make you pick up more dissolved oxygen. So it again cuts both ways. Lastly, for SO2 monitoring, first off, the book up there on the left, The Chemical Analysis of Grapes and Wine by Patrick Island. I think every winery should have a copy of this book on the lab bench. It's plasticized so you can get it wet. And it, for me, is the lab wine chemistry, go-to book. It just tells you how to run everything effectively, repeatably, but you can follow it, from like a layman can follow it. So I would highly recommend having a copy of that book. I would monitor SO2 at juice stage, after alcoholic fermentation, if no MLF is going to happen, or after malolactic fermentation, every 4 to 6 weeks during aging, and after a big dissolved oxygen pickup event. And conveniently, there are links here. Dr. Botezatu has made some really easy to follow videos on how to set up and run an aeration oxidation apparatus, which is the picture on the lower left there. It's a very simple, and an analysis to run, I highly recommend actually using an aeration oxidation apparatus as opposed to like one of those prefabricated kits. This analysis isn't difficult, and it's going to be far more reliable than using some of those prefab kits, in my opinion. And Dr. B has done a great job of giving you some YouTube resources to help you set all of that up. It's really not difficult. So with that, if there are any questions, I know we kind of covered a lot, but I think that there are some uses for SO2, but maybe some alternatives as well. So with that, I'll take your questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Seth. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for hanging in there too with technical difficulties. I'd like to point out that about a year ago, probably we wouldn't have been able to solve that issue, and we probably would have had to terminate. So I'm glad you stuck with us and we made it through. So we've got a couple of questions here, and there's still plenty of time to add to the chat box. We'll start from the top. Andrew Chalk is asking, what white wine varieties are high in tannin?
I mean, yeah, there are definitely some that are naturally higher in tannin. I mean, like things like Verdelho. There are some that are naturally high in tannin. I'm making the argument, and this is just my opinion, that almost all white wines in Texas, especially ones that were grown on the high plains and mechanically harvested, are going to have elevated levels of tannin. And I think you can see it in the color of the wine if it's not stripped out. If you don't take out those tannins, I think you can see it, and I think it allows them to oxidize more quickly. But that's just opinion. I mean, it stands to reason that if you're going to harvest fruit mechanically, you're going to have the skin in contact with the juice until it gets to the winery or to the nearest press, and that's going to leave you with higher levels of tannin in your white wine than you might normally see if you hand harvested that fruit.
Okay. From the same person, is microbial growth concave with respect to pH? So in other words, alkaline is also unfriendly.
I mean, yeah, if you got to super high alkaline levels, your pH is super high, like 10 plus, absolutely. It's going to, now granted, there's some acidophilic microbes that prefer acidic environments, and, we can get into a lot of back and forth on this, but for wine purposes, and the microbes that we are concerned about, there's two things that inhibit growth naturally of microbes in wine. It's alcohol and acid, right? And, we don't have the benefit of super low acidity. So the difference between pH 3 and 4 is going to be 10 times, right? It's a logarithmic scale. So, like I said, in New York, you had super low pH, and that made it a much more hostile environment. But pH 4 is much less hostile. And so there's a lot more ability for those microbes to grow. There's still enough that it's not like a food safety issue. I mean, like when you get up into the pH of milk where there's no alcohol and no acid, that's why we have, if you've ever been inside a dairy, you have to wear like a full biosuit because there's things that can grow in there that can kill you. We still don't have to worry about that in wine, but we certainly can have spoilage microbes.
Great. How about macro ox? So what is macro ox?
Yeah, this is a method that's used to remove tannin in white wines at the juice phase, and it's pretty easy and pretty handy. There's some good literature out there on it from the scientific community, and essentially it's injecting oxygen into the juice and using that. I mentioned it at one point, polyphenol oxidase, to oxidize out your tannins, and then they'll all fall out. And this is before fermentation, so you can get away with that, and it won't lead to oxidized wine down the road. The only misconception that I need to point out while I've got the stage is that I had one winemaker telling me, "Oh, I'm stirring the juice to macrooxide." I'm like, no. You have to reach a full saturation of dissolved oxygen, like 10 milligrams per liter. I mean, like you inject pure oxygen gas into the wine in order to achieve a macro-ox effect, but it's essentially removing your tannins at the juice phase with oxygen.
Okay, there was a request to repeat the name of the Patrick Island book. I will.
Yeah, Chemical Analysis of Grapes and Wine by Patrick Island, I-L-A-N-D.
Okay, yeah, I just posted that in the chat as well. Okay, so the next question. So the take-home point: SO2 doesn't help protect wines against microbes, particularly in Texas. SO2 only helps prevent oxidation. Question is, do you add SO2 at bottling of red or white wines?
Yeah. So again, I try not to think of it of do I add it at a certain step. I'm trying to look at it as, when am I going to pick up oxygen, and when am I going to, and what do I have to protect myself against that? So if I have a high level of free SO2 in the wine, so I've analyzed it and I have 35 to 40 parts per million, then no, I probably don't need to add SO2 even prior to bottling, because you're going to pick up oxygen at bottling. There's no way of avoiding that. But if my free SO2 was at 20 parts per million, I might bump that up a little bit just because I know I'm going to pick up some oxygen.
Excellent. Well, thank you. There's another question, and I think you may have answered this when you talked about macro ox, but the follow-up was how does macro differ from micro oxygenation?
Right. Micro-ox is usually metered out through an apparatus at very, very low dosages, so much so that you shouldn't see a rise in dissolved oxygen when you're using micro-ox. Essentially, it's like micro doses of oxygen so that you don't add dissolved oxygen. And so that's usually done after fermentation. When you are concerned about oxygen levels, it's usually used to either stabilize color or more rapidly age the wine, and macro-ox is done at the juice phase.
Excellent. Okay, there's a request for you to go back over what you said when you were talking about that half of metabisulfite is SO2. You were talking about the weight. I do.
Yeah. I mean, so potassium metabisulfite, right? There's other things in there than just pure SO2, right? So that it's otherwise it'd just be raw SO2 powder, right? And that's not what that is. So only about half of your powder by weight is SO2. And so when you use, I posted up a picture earlier there of a fancy calculator, wineads.com, really complicated stuff there. Yes, as a professional winemaker, I still use it. When you say I want to raise the free SO2 40 parts per million in an online calculator like that, they take that into effect. And I actually wrote the guy who designed it and asked him just to make sure. But they already take into effect that it's 57% by weight SO2. I, again, argue that it's probably closer to half in reality, so I might add a little bit more than they recommend. But that's just me.
Great. Okay, well, we've got one more here, and it is, what is the ideal temperature for bulk wine storage and aging, understanding that low temps can increase dissolved oxygen?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely go back and forth on that. I mean, cellar temp has always been 58. That's back when they had cellars underground, and that's how wine was made for a long time. That's what we keep our barrel aging rooms at, is at 58, and same for bottled wine storage. But in the tank room, if I'm going to be moving the wine a lot, say like for filtration, I will actually turn the refrigerant off. So I won't keep that wine at 58. If I'm going to be moving it a lot, I actually let the temperature come up. But for long-term aging, yeah, we keep the wine at 58.
Can you mention that sulfite calculator again?
Yeah, very complicated stuff. Wineads.com is the one that I use. Wine Business Monthly has a calculator as well. But yeah, I mean, I use those tools even as a professional winemaker.
Okay, I see the one for Wine Business Monthly. I'll stick a link here in the chat real quick. Okay. All right. Does anyone else have any last minute questions here? Okay. Well, we thank you very much, Seth. That was a great presentation. Excellent content. I think everyone got something out of it, so we appreciate it. And if anybody missed out, or these are going to be recorded and available on the Twiga website.
Yes, thank you, Justin, and both to Dr. B and Seth. Excellent presentations, very timely. The presentations are currently on the website, as well as the bios of your two presenters today. And as soon as the recordings are downloaded, I will get them uploaded onto the Twiga YouTube channel and share them on our webpage, and I will post that as well. We do have another presentation at 12 noon. This is specifically for Twiga. It is open to the public. We are going to have a very important discussion today, though, about the new temporary event applications that seem to be causing quite a bit of confusion. So we have asked Kimberly Frost to join us. She is Twiga's TABC attorney, and she's going to address these very timely issues so that we can ensure all the wineries in Texas can continue business as usual. Again, if any of you all have questions or concerns, please put them in the chat or feel free to contact me directly at sabrina@twiga.org. I really want to give a big shout out to Meredith and Justin for all their efforts and hard work to putting these educational sessions together. It is a lot of work, a lot of organizations and logistics, and they've just done a fantastic job. So thank you, Justin and Meredith. You make us all very proud.
You bet. We're happy to do it.
Meredith deserves the most credit.
I don't know about that.
Before we leave, can I just add something?
Absolutely.
This is Andrea again. I wanted to thank Seth for including the links to the YouTube videos there, the Enology How-To series. Yeah, I encourage everyone to check them out. They're really short videos, very practical. And also, if you guys have anything that you'd like me to make a video on, any kind of technique or equipment or anything like that, that's wine related, wine lab related, please let me know. Send me an email. Tell me what you'd like me to do, and I'll do my best to do that and post them on my YouTube channel. Thanks.
Oh, that's a great resource, Dr. B. Thank you.
Yeah, but
Okay. The presentation for the Twiga at 12 noon is on a different channel, different Zoom channel. So this will this meeting will be ended. And if you will look on the emails that have been sent out or look on our webpage, the Zoom presentation call is on those sites. All right. Thank you all very much. We appreciate your time and hope to see you again on October 26th for our next sessions of education. And then also, don't forget about Grape Camp. That is November 9th and 10th in Dripping Springs. The education series will be rolled out right after Labor Day, and we look forward to having everybody attend. Thank you all.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.